So, last time we were at this point right here, and we were getting ready to talk about what happens to these bonds as they age. But first, let's start with a question. I've got up here on the board a premium bond and a discount bond. We're going to look at the relationship between coupon rate and yield to maturity. And we're going to put a greater than or a less than sign in here. Can anyone tell me what I should put here?
Greater than.
Yeah, very good. Greater than. And the way to remember that is that the coupons are more than enough to satisfy the investor's required return, and that's why they're willing to put up with a capital loss, which we'll get to here in a second. Then for the discount, of course, it's going to be the opposite. The coupon rate is less than the yield of maturity because the coupons are not enough to satisfy the investor's demand for yield of maturity. Then they are going to demand a capital gain over the life of the bond. Let's throw one more up here just for fun. We've got a par bond. What's the relationship between coupon rate and yield of maturity?
They're equal.
Yeah, they're equal. Do you think this might be something good to have on your note sheet?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably so. I guarantee you in the heat of the exam, it'll be easier for you to remember if it's on the note sheet, right? Okay, now we're going to talk about what happens to a bond over its bond's value over its life. But first, let's start with an example. When you hold a baby in your arms and you look at the baby, you might have big dreams for this baby. Maybe this baby's going to be an astronaut. Maybe the baby's going to be president. You might even dream big and hope that your baby turns into a finance professor. You know, it could happen, right? Now, we don't know what's going to happen. The kid could turn out to be a criminal, right? We just have no idea. But what is the one thing that we know with certainty about this baby? Say again?
He will grow.
He will grow. I don't even know that. Did you know that after babies are born, they actually lose weight? Do you think all babies make it past the first few days? No. So we don't know that the baby's going to grow. What else?
Age increase.
Say again?
Age increase.
I'm having trouble understanding that first word.
Age. The age increases.
Oh, it gets easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't know that for sure. Because I don't know if you've ever been called by a 17-year-old in the middle of the night to come get him out of jail. Okay. So, folks, there's only one thing we know for certain. There's only one thing we know. Ms. Raffel, what do we know for sure? You work at the health department. The baby's going to die. Now, we don't know when, right? But we all are going to end up at the exact same situation. Regardless of what we do with our lives, we're all going to end up back at the same point of being dead at some point or another. It's the great equalizer. Now, why would I tell you that horrible, horrible story? The answer is because bonds are like babies. No matter where they start life, they all end up at exactly the same place. And that same place is face value. That same place is face value. So let's think about this. Let's roll it all the way down to the end of the bond's life. And we are 1 second away from the bond maturing. We receive that last interest payment. And what are we going to be receiving in the next second? How much money? Say again? The face value, right? Because you got to get the coupon in the face value, right? How much is face value unless I tell you otherwise? $1,000. Very good. Okay, so if you're going to receive $1,000 in 1 second, how much is that worth to you? This isn't a trick question. Yeah, it's $1,000, right? This is why every bond, regardless of where they start life, will end at $1,000. Now, what does that mean for premium bonds? It means that over their life, as they get closer and closer to maturity, that their value will go down. And so you might want to write this one down. This is actually part of this is good for a multiple choice question. over a premium bond's life, the investor expects a capital loss. Over the bond's life, over a premium bond's life, they expect a capital loss. And it has to be that way because they're starting higher than 1,000 and they're ending at 1,000. You're guaranteed to have a capital loss if you invest in a premium bond. Okay, now let's take a look at the discount bond. In the beginning, it's worth less than the face value, but over its life, the value is going to get closer and closer to face value. And so investors, this is another good one to write down. Investors in a discount bond expect a capital gain over the life of the bond. Investors in a discount bond expect a capital gain over the life of the bond. Now, I told you on a premium bond that you are guaranteed to get a capital loss. But I can't say that about a discount bond. Why can't I, I can't say the flip side. Why can't I say you're guaranteed to get a capital gain? What could possibly happen that would keep you from getting your capital gain? What if the company went bankrupt? If the company went bankrupt and they were unable to pay that $1,000 at the end, then you would not get your capital gain. So we can't say you're guaranteed to have a capital gain on a discount bond. Okay, now I have, in this picture that I put up here, the assumption is that the yield to maturity stays the same over the life of the bonds. But in reality, that is probably not going to happen. But the only difference would be in the smoothness of this line. So for instance, if you've got a jumpy yield to maturity, it would just look like this, but it's going to wind up in exactly the same place. And the same thing down here with the discount bond. As we're going to have bumpiness as we get closer and closer, but you're going to wind up at the same point. Yes?
I'm sorry, I know you said this last class, but can you repeat why? So if we were to invest in a premium bond, even though the face value would be the same over a period of time, would you just still be interested because of the dividends or interest?
Okay, so the reason is the required, so when we invest money, we look for a required return. That required return is based on the risk. And so that required return here is going to be the yield to maturity. Now, if that yield to maturity happens to be less than the coupon rate, then I am willing to pay more for the bond. And that capital loss on a premium bond is going to offset this fact that this coupon rate is greater than the yield to maturity. So your return is going to be exactly the yield to maturity. Down here on the discount bond, if those coupons are too skinny, if your yield to maturity is greater, then you're going to demand not only the coupons, but you're going to demand a capital gain. And that's going to be how you're going to get the extra return that you need from the bond. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Cool. I know I never understand anything the first time I hear it, so I never have a problem repeating. Okay, questions? How much is a bond worth at the end of its life? 1,000. Face value. Okay, now let's move on to current yield. And this one causes students all sorts of trouble. Current yield, you might think, oh, well, that's the yield to maturity right now. It's not. Current yield is its own thing. And it's actually quite easy to calculate. It is the annual coupon divided by the bond price. It's the annual coupon divided by the bond price. When you read the question, always look and see if it's asking for current yield, or if the question writer were being really cruel, they might say the current yield to maturity, then you'd actually figure out the yield to maturity. Now, if you are fortunate on the problems for current yield, I will only give you enough information to calculate current yield. I will not also give you enough information to calculate yield to maturity. If you are unfortunate, I will give you enough information to do both. And do you think the yield to maturity would be one of the other answers? Yeah. Yep. Okay, so have this on your note sheet. The current yield is equal to the annual coupon divided by the bond price. Now, for the discount bonds' current yield is lower than the yield of maturity because it is ignoring that capital gain that you get. And so you've got your annual coupons, and on a discount bond, those things are skinny. And so this current yield is going to be lower than the yield of maturity because that yield of maturity also includes that capital gain that you're going to get on that bond as it gets closer and closer to maturity. On the flip side, for premium bonds, the current yield is higher than the yield of maturity because it ignores that capital loss as the bond price falls to face value. So you've got your annual coupons and they are fat, and you're dividing by the price on that, and that's going to give you a number that is higher than the yield to maturity. So do you need to know those last two things? Probably not, but definitely have that formula on your note sheet. Questions? So now let's talk about interest rate risk. Another name for interest rate risk is price risk, and we talked about this in chapter 10. We said that there were two kinds of risk when you loan money to people. There is default risk, the risk that the borrower doesn't pay, and there is interest rate or price risk, and that is that the risk of the value of this thing is going to change over time based on changes in interest rates. And we know that the value of a bond is just an addition of a bunch of different present values. And so what makes the present value go up? If R goes down. Of course, we're going to keep this the same. But if R goes down, we know that this goes up. And so we've got this relationship between interest rates and bond prices. When interest rates go down, bond prices go up. When interest rates go up, bond prices go down. Now, it turns out that every bond out there isn't equally susceptible to this risk. There are a couple of factors that are going to impact how sensitive a bond is. But first, before we get into that, I'm going to teach you some Latin. And the Latin we're going to use today is ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus simply means all else equal. All else equal. So we're going to say all else equal, bonds with longer time to maturity are more sensitive to changes in interest rates. Now, why would that be the case? Think about the face value of two different bonds. One of them is out there for one more year. And so its T here is 1. And so any little change in the interest rate only gets magnified to the first power. But what if we have a bond that's going to be out there for 30 years? Then any little change in the interest rate is going to get magnified to the 30th power. So you can see that that little changes in interest rates are going to impact that long life bond a lot, and the short life bond very little comparatively. Now, the other thing that's going to impact your interest rate risk is the size of the coupons. Because remember, this bond price is the sum of the present value of all the individual payments that you're going to receive. And so let's assume we've got a bond here, and it's got semi-annual coupons. You're going to get the first one after 6 months. And so the T on that bond is only 0.5. And so the change in interest rate is only magnified to the 0.5 power. For the second coupon, what would the T be?
2.
Ooh, it'd actually be 1 if we're talking about years, right? Because the first one was 0.5 and the second one's 1. And do you see how this works? So every coupon that's out there, in the beginning, of course, they've got very little interest rate risk because they're only out there for a short time. But the closer and closer we get to the end, the greater the interest rate risk is. But because you add all those together to come up with the price of the bond, it means that a bond with larger coupons gets more of its present value from the coupons, and therefore the present value isn't impacted as much by those changes in interest rates. Now think about a bond with no coupons at all. That's like the tiniest bond coupon you can get. It's called a zero coupon bond. Where is all the value of that bond coming from? There's only one cash flow out there. What is it? Say again? No, there is a zero coupon bond. Where is the entire cash flow of that bond coming from? Yeah, the face value, right? And so you've got this one single payment hanging way out there. And so the entirety of the bond is being swung around by those interest rates to the 30th power. That's not true with the fat coupon bond because the earlier coupons are only to the 0.5 power, to the 1, to the 1.5, things like that. And so a greater percentage of the value of that bond is from the coupons, and therefore greater value, the coupons are less sensitive to interest rate risk. Therefore, bonds with smaller coupons are going to be more sensitive to interest rate changes. Questions? Do you think it's important to know what two things make bonds sensitive to interest rate changes? Yeah. I would put that on my note sheet. Okay, so let's take a look at an example so you can see this for yourself. And we've got two bonds here, and one of them is a 30-year bond and the other one is a 1-year bond. Other than their time to maturity, they are exactly identical. So can anybody, and by the way, that interest rate on the bottom, scratch that out and write yield to maturity. Scratch that out and write yield to maturity. Now, looking at this picture and knowing what the face value of the bond is, can anybody tell me what we know about the coupon rate for this bond?
For
Say again?
which the year?
Well, the coupon rate's the same on both of them. And the coupon rate doesn't change over time.
So then the face value would be different.
Okay, so the face value is the same. So what we're looking at here is the price, those lines are the price. But there's a point at which that price is precisely equal to the face value. What kind of bond would we call that?
The par bond.
Yeah, it's par bond. And about par bonds, what do we know?
30.
Yeah, the coupon rate's equal to the yield of maturity. What's the yield of maturity when these things are both worth 1,000?
10%.
Yeah, 10%. So what's the coupon rate? 10%. Does that make sense? Now, they do show it down below. It says value of a bond with 10% coupon. Now, so the only difference between these two is the length of the time to maturity. And let's talk about the two bonds. I'm holding the 1-year bond. You're holding the 30-year bond. And interest rates drop. And they drop from 10% down to, or the yield of maturity drops from 10 down to 5. And my bond has gone up 4.762%. And I'm so excited, I call you and I'm like, hey, my bond's up 4.762%. And you laugh. Why are you laughing at me? This other bond belongs to you, right? What was your increase in value there? A lot more, right? 76.862%. Wow! Right? So I'm calling you to brag about my piddly 4.762%, and you've picked up that much. You're just feeling really, really happy. But then the Fed starts hiking interest rates, and yield to maturities go up. In fact, they go up from 10% to 20%. And I call you again, and I am crying because I have lost 8.3% of the value of my bond. That's down to $916.67. What do you say? Are you still doing better than I am? No, now your bond's worth about half what it was. That's how big this interest rate risk is. It can swing things in a huge way. So I got invited to talk to a trust company. Do you guys know what a trust company is? So a trust is where you put money and you're going to have someone called a fiduciary keep an eye on it and distribute that money to the beneficiaries as you've designated it. So let's say you've got an idiot nephew and you know you can't just give him $2 million because he'll just go blow it and he'll be right back where he started. And so you put that money in a trust. And then you have that trust pay out enough money to keep your idiot nephew in food and clothes, right? Because you know he's never going to be able to hold a job. That's what a trust company is. Now, trust companies, do you think their clients tend to be poor or wealthy? Say again? Wealthy, yeah, wealthy. I'm sorry, I misheard you. I thought you said poor. I'm like, woo! Yeah, here's my $1.82. Put it in the... Okay, so we've got these wealthy people. Now, I was invited to speak to this trust company here in town, and they had their 12 most important clients. Who do you think the 12 most important clients of a trust company are? Yeah, the richest ones. And so I walk into the room, and there's all these old dudes. All these old dudes. And when we talked about what they'd done with their lives, it was amazing. They had held some pretty responsible positions, started businesses, things like that. So they were well-to-do. And so I'm giving the talk, and I had prepared some stuff in advance, and I said, okay, how many of you have recently bought a United States 30-year Treasury bond? Of course, they're old dudes, right? They all raise their hands. And I say, well, let's look at what is the yield and maturity on those bonds. I said, the most recent one that I see is 3.875%. And they say, yeah, that sounds right. At the time, it was right. And I said, and of course the coupons, they do those to match, right? And they're like, yeah. And so the coupon on these bonds was 3.875%. And I said, okay, there is one thing that we know with certainty in finance. We know very few things, but we do know this. Interest rates are mean reverting. What do you think mean reverting means? What's the mean? We've calculated means in here before, right? Yeah, the average. If you revert to something, you go back to it. And so what we're saying is that interest rates over time go back to their historical averages. Right now you guys think interest rates are going through the roof. No, they're just returning to their historical averages. They're mean reverting. I said, okay, I've done some calculations here. I figured out that the historical mean on the 30-year U.S. Treasury bond is about 7%. I said, does that sound right? And they said, yes. I said, okay, here's what's going to happen. If your brand new 3.875% bond, if interest rates go back to their normal level, you're going to lose about 43% of the value of that bond. Oh, and I also asked them, do you think your investment's safe? Of course, they all raise their hands. 43%. What do you think the reaction in the room was? Here these people are, and they thought they had safe investments. And in fact, the guy sitting in the room from the trust company told them that's a safe investment. And yet, interest rate risk alone could cause that bond to lose 43% of its value. I thought we might have to call an ambulance, because there were a couple of people that were having trouble breathing at that point. Now, my next question is this. Do you think I ever got invited back to speak to the investors there again? No. Mission accomplished, right? Okay. By the way, I don't get paid for these speaking engagements. I just get trotted out. Okay. So, that is my story to tell you about interest rate risk. What are the two things that make interest rate risk greater on a bond? We just talked about them. Number one is? Go ahead. Okay, very good. And number two was? Okay, and what is it? Little coupons or big coupons? Yeah, smaller coupons. Very good. Okay, now let's talk about interest rate risk in the real world. And we have a bond. It's a 100-year bond that was issued in 1995 by General Motors. Now, why in the world would you issue a 100-year bond? There are a couple of good reasons to issue a 100-year bond. Any ideas? Have you ever heard of locking in an interest rate? Oh, okay. So we've got a low interest rate, right? So roll yourself back 5 years. Low interest rates, what do? You go out and borrow a lot of money for a long term. So 1995, GM goes out and they issued this 100-year bond. And interest rates were lower, for sure, than they would be in the near future. But the other thing that's going on there is that General Motors has inside information about its crappy financial condition, right? Do you think managers know more than investors about what's going on at a company? Yeah. Not everything is in the annual report. And by the way, do you think managers can see down the road and see things that you can't? Yeah. And so as a result, if a company thinks they're about to undergo hard times where they might not be able to borrow money, what will they do? They'll go out and borrow a bunch of money in advance for two reasons. Number one, they might get locked out of the market, but number two, even if they have to, even if they're allowed to borrow, they're going to have to borrow at higher rates once the market figures out how bad a shape they're in. And so there are at least two good reasons for GM to jump out there. Okay, now, on the date, December 31st, 95, that's when it was, first came out, issued. On that day, the price was $1,000, and the coupon rate was 7%. What does that tell us the yield to maturity was on that date? What kind of bond is it when it sells at its face value? What do we call it? Par bond. And what's the relationship between coupon rate and yield to maturity for a par bond? Yeah, they're got to be equal. Okay, so we're going to assume then the yield to maturity is 7%. Now, the price on July 31st, 1996 is down to $800. What must have happened to interest rates or yield to maturity? Yeah, they had to have gone up because we know that they've got this inverse relationship. And so now the yield to maturity is greater than the coupon rate, or we could say the coupon rate's less than the yield to maturity, and therefore it's now a discount bond. This thing lost 20% of its value in 7 months. Why did it move so hugely? The answer is, of course, because of this huge time to maturity. These little interest rates, especially out there on the face value, or these payments are out there to the 100th power, right? That face value is hanging out there to the 100th power. So these little changes in R get magnified in a huge, huge way. Okay, now the price on September 26th, 2007 was 1,020.29. What kind of bond would we call that? Yeah, we're going to call that a premium bond, and now we know the coupon rate is greater than the yield to maturity, so we know the yield to maturity must now be less than 7. Here it had to have been greater than 7, but here it's less than 7. So we had a 27.5% gain in the value of this bond over that 11-year period. This shows you exactly how much these swings can happen. Now, it would have been more impactful if they had actually had put the yield of maturities up here, so you can see that the changes don't necessarily have to be that big. Now, let's ask this question. What do you think, by the way, this bond matures 2095. What do you think this bond's worth today? Any ideas? Not a lot. Why do you say so? Okay, so assuming this bond was still around, interest rates are up, we would actually see this thing probably being a discount bond again. That's a good thought. But what happened, though, to General Motors in 2008, 2009 timeframe? Does anyone remember? Yeah, they went bankrupt. They went bankrupt. Now, what do you think this bond's worth now? Big goose egg, right? It's worth nothing. And these old guys that I was telling you about at the trust company, oh, they were just mad as hell. Because just like they trusted in the United States government, who else do you think that they would trust? General Motors, right? So their generation, the World War II generation, would always say what's good for General Motors is good for America. And so those are two things that they would hold on to, is that GM is safe and so is the US. And so they felt a real sense of betrayal when this bond went to zero. Questions? Yeah,
Maybe just hypothetically.
okay.
GM, when they're starting to produce a lot of like electric cars, so
Uh-huh.
they go up a little bit, even though they're still like in the gutter.
No, so these bonds, when we went through this whole bankruptcy, the bonds, everything got restructured, right? And so everything's basically reset to new. And so now that, so GM bonds now may be growing in value, who knows? But this bond's not still around. Dead bonds don't go up in value. Isn't that awful? Yeah. Okay, and the other thing to think about with your question was about electric cars. So, who had the first mover advantage there?
Tesla.
Tesla. What is GM and Ford, what are they having to do to try to catch up?
Make electric cars.
They're having to spend a boatload of money to get into this business, right? The battery factories alone are billions, right? And then there's the research and development and all that kind of stuff. What's that going to do to the financial health of the firms in the short term?
It's gonna make them go broke.
Yeah, so it may actually kill them. And are we sure that electric cars are the wave of the future?
No.
No. Mr. Ali says they are.
No, I said, I agree with.
Oh, okay, very good. Yeah, we don't know that they're the wave of the future. I know this, until they make one that allows me to drive all the way down to my in-laws and back, I'm not getting one, right? I can stop at the Come and Go in Rogers, Arkansas and fill my tank, but I don't want to hang around in some lot waiting for some schmuck to get out of a spot so I can plug in and stand there for 40 minutes with my thumb in my ear, right? I don't want to do that. Does that make sense? Okay. Questions? Other questions? Now let's talk about reinvestment risk. We talked about interest rate risk, and that interest rate risk hurts you when interest rates go up, right? By the way, reinvestment risk is interest rate risk is a two-sided weapon, right? When interest rates are down, it actually helps you. When interest rates are up, it hurts you. Let's talk about reinvestment risk. It's the risk that your future proceeds will have to be reinvested at a lower rate of return. So let's assume that you've got a 10% coupon bond out there, and so you're getting $50 every 6 months from that bond. And let's assume that the interest rate at the time you bought the bond was 10%, so it was sold at par. Now, what happens if interest rates drop to 5%? When you get that money, you have to reinvest it at the lower rate, unless you're spending it, right? You have to reinvest it at that lower rate. And that might not sound like a big deal for these $50 coupons, but what happens when you get to that $1,000 at the end? Now you're going to invest that bond. So let's say that the yield to maturity is $1,000. Likely, the coupon rate on your new bond is going to be, it's going to match the yield to maturity of 5%. And so now, instead of getting $50 coupons from each bond, you're only getting 25. What if you were depending on the bond for your ability to eat? What's that going to do to you? $50 down to 25. Would you guys like I realize many of you have a zero income right now, but assuming that you did, would you like to take a 50% pay cut? No! And so that's the problem with reinvestment risk. It's the risk that we're going to have to reinvest the proceeds at a lower rate. And though it sounds worse for the face value, it's also true for those little coupons. Now let's talk about what makes a bond sensitive to reinvestment risk. It's exactly the opposite things from interest rate risk. It's exactly the opposite things from interest rate risk. So let's think about this. If you've got two bonds, the two bonds that we had up here earlier, one of them's got 30 years to maturity, and one of them's only got 1 year to maturity. Which one of those has a greater reinvestment risk?
One of the larger.
Is it 1 year?
Yeah, the 1 year, because you're gonna get that money in 1 year, and what are you gonna have to do with it? You're gonna have to reinvest it, right? In fact, if you were just in the habit of buying 1-year bonds, you would have to reinvest 29 times before the other bond matured. And so time to maturity, it was bad for interest rate risk, but longer time to maturity actually reduces reinvestment risk. Now let's talk about coupons. If I've got fat coupons, that means I'm getting a load of money every 6 months. And what do I have to do with it? Reinvest it, unless I spend it. I'm going to reinvest it, and I'm going to be faced with this problem every 6 months. And the larger those coupons are, the more the problem is. And so fat coupons here mean greater risk, where they meant less risk when we talked about interest rate risk. And so it's exactly the opposite. And so if you are taking on interest rate risk, you are not getting reinvestment risk. If you are taking on reinvestment risk, you're not getting as much interest rate risk. And so basically it's pick your poison, right? You have to choose which you're going to do. Questions? Can you get away from risk? No. You're either going to have high interest rate risk and low reinvestment risk, or vice versa. That is all for bond valuation. Now we're on to bond features. So the first thing I want to tell you about bonds and debt in particular is that it is not an ownership claim. So oftentimes you'll be in a place, let's call it the Waffle House, and you'll hear two guys talking about one of them has a brand new Harley Davidson. This is before the fight breaks out, so it's still safe to be at the Waffle House. You guys know about Waffle House and fights? Oh my goodness, you guys need to go hang out in the Waffle House. You catch some great fights. Back to the story. So you hear these guys talking, and one of them says to the other one, "Hey man, I like your Harley." And the other one, the owner of the bike, says, the bank owns it. What does he mean? Say again. Yeah, he's making payments. He probably owes more money on the bike than it's worth, perhaps. But does the bank truly own the bike? No, he still owns the bike, and as long as he makes the payments, he will never lose ownership of the bike. And so it's a fallacy to say that anyone that has debt secured by an item or the company, that they have an ownership claim. When is the only time that the bank would take ownership of the man's Harley Davidson? Yeah, if he doesn't make the payments, then they're going to take that bike back. And so it's only when a company goes bankrupt that the bondholders take possession of the assets. And at that point, they become the owners. But then, of course, they're no longer the lenders. They're now the equity owners of the firm. And they just take the assets that are left over. Okay. Now, so that's the first thing. Don't ever think of bonds as an ownership claim unless the company's gone bankrupt. Number two, the company's payment of interest is considered a cost of doing business. And so they are able to subtract that interest out before they calculate their taxes. And so that means the more interest that you are paying, the lower your taxes are going to be. So there is a tax benefit of debt, a tax shield that's given to you by debt. I've got a mortgage, and the United States government allows me, if I itemize and I meet a certain amount, they allow me to reduce my taxable income by the amount of the interest that I pay. And it's true for companies too. Okay, would you be able to say the same thing about those periodic payments that you get from stock? We call them dividends. No, dividends are not tax deductible. And if you don't believe me, what you want to do is look at an income statement, and you'll be coming along there and you'll see interest gets subtracted out. Then they figure the taxes, and then there is no mention of dividends until after the taxes are already figured and paid. And so dividends are not tax deductible. So equity does not have the same tax benefits as debt. Unpaid debt is a liability of the firm. What is liability? Liability is a legal obligation to pay. A liability is a legal obligation to pay. And so if I fail to meet that legal obligation to pay, then the lenders can take control of the assets, just like we talked about the bank taking the man's Harley Davidson. Now a little vocabulary here. Short-term debt versus long-term. What's the breakover point in finance and accounting? Yeah, 1 year. And so we're looking here and we say if it's less than or equal to 1 year, we're going to call that short-term debt. Now, here's this term, original issue maturity, and I talked about it last time. That is the amount of time to maturity on the day that that this instrument was issued, right? And so if it was a 30-year bond and it's only got 1 year left, it's still considered long-term debt, right? Because it's the original issue maturity that matters. And so only things that have 1 year or less to maturity when they're issued would be considered to be short-term debt. Long-term debt has that original issue maturity greater than 1 year. And then we can break down our long-term debt into two different groups. We have notes, and they're going to have original issue maturity between 1 and 10 years. And then bonds actually have an original issue maturity greater than 10 years. Now this is kind of confusing because we generically refer to all of these things as bonds, right? But in truth, bonds here are actually a subset of bonds, a subset that has original issue maturity greater than 10 years. Very confusing. You have my apologies. Questions? Okay, now let's talk about the bond indenture. And that's just an agreement between the borrower and the lender. And we're going to have lots of different, I'm not going to walk through those because I'm going to go through each one of them in detail. But I'm going to ask you this. Raise your hand if you've ever borrowed money at a bank. Okay, Ms. Rafael, when you borrowed money at a bank, who wrote the contract? You or the bank? The bank did. So the bank, as the lender, writes the contract. Bonds, however, are weird. The borrower writes the contract. The borrower writes the contract. And here's why. There is one borrower and many, 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 many lenders. And even in a group this small, I would have trouble getting you all to agree on a set of terms that you wanted for these bonds. And so what do I do instead? I create a set of conditions here that I think are going to be attractive to potential bond buyers. And I create that contract and I set it out there and I say, hey, here are my bonds, here are the conditions, anyone interested in buying them? And at that point, I will attract lenders who are okay with the terms that I put out there. So it always freaks people out to learn, but sometimes the borrower writes the loan contract. Okay, let's talk about these different things. Number one, the terms of the bond issue. One of them is the face value. What's the face value, unless I tell you otherwise? 1,000. Now, you might say, well, everybody knows that the default face value is 1,000, therefore I don't need to put it into the bond itself. Do you think that's smart thinking? Yeah, I don't need to put it into the contract. I've got to put it into the contract. The lawyers aren't going to let me get by with that. And so it's going to be in there. Then there's the coupon rate, the maturity date, and then finally the bond form, registered versus bearer. Now, we haven't talked too much about bond form yet, but there are basically two ways you can have bonds. And I'll start with the original way, which was the bearer bond. The bearer bond is the big piece of paper I explained to you previously that's got the little coupons along the bottom, and you cut the little coupons off and you turn them in and you get your money. That's the way bonds were for a long, 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 long time. Now we have what are called registered bonds. In fact, the bonds probably don't even exist in paper form. They're probably purely electronic entry somewhere. And those are different in that the coupons are sent directly to you, probably direct deposit to your bank. And then when the bond matures, the face value gets sent to you, probably directly deposited into your bank. Now, on a bearer bond, who do you think is able to collect the coupons and then the face value? What do you think a bearer is? Yeah, whoever has that bond gets to collect the coupons and then the face value at maturity. Okay, now let's think of some potentially dangerous situations that could result from that. Mr. Burstein, what could possibly happen that would make this thing go badly if I owned a bearer bond?
Well, from what I know in James Bond movies, is that if someone takes it, they have possession of it, and therefore it's theirs.
Yeah, if someone takes a bearer bond, then they're able to catch those coupons. Does that make sense? And so let's say that you've got bearer bonds and you've stuffed them between the mattress and box springs in your guest room, and then your sleazy nephew comes over. He's had my class. He's looking for dirty magazines. Instead, he finds your bearer bonds. And then he's like, whoa, I know what to do with these. Whoop, right? Takes off with your bearer bonds. The next morning, you call General Electric, the issuer of the bearer bonds, and you say, someone stole my bearer bonds. Are they going to say, oh, don't worry, we're just going to send you replacements? No. If that worked, every morning of the world, I would be calling GE and saying, it happened again. Someone stole my bearer bonds. Can you send me some more? Right? Does that make sense? Because I'd just be collecting them. And so that can't be allowed to happen. So when they're gone, they're gone. Now, back to the scenario in which you have them hidden between the mattress and the box springs of your own bed, and you're watching something on Netflix, you've had too much to drink, and you fall asleep with a cigarette in your hand. Don't confess if you've done this before. But you fall asleep with a cigarette in your hand. What's going to likely happen to your mattress? It's going to catch fire. Luckily, you wake up just in time, and you escape the flames, and you are grateful for your life. But then, what crosses your mind? Yeah, my bearer bonds. And so they can get destroyed in a fire. What if there's a flood? When I lived down in Mississippi, Hurricane Katrina came out and wiped out like the first mile and a half inland and washed all that stuff out to sea. Do you think any bearer bonds would have survived that and flown back to their owners and landed on their new porch? No. And so there are lots of dangers with bearer bonds. But there are also opportunities. And let's discuss registered bonds first before we get to the opportunities for bearer bonds. So a registered bond, when I buy one of these, I have to give some information to the issuer. Number one, I have to give them my name. Number two, I have to give them my address. Number three, I have to give them my social security number or taxpayer identification number. Now, what do you think they report every time they make a payment to me? They report that payment to the taxing authority, right? And what happens if when I file my taxes, I don't report that income? Do you think they're going to know? Absolutely they're going to know. And so registered bonds are lousy for cheating on your taxes. Registered bonds are lousy for cheating on your taxes. Bearer bonds are much more preferred for cheating on your taxes. So, for instance, in Europe, they actually have a lot more bearer bonds, and that's because people prefer bearer bonds because Europeans love to cheat on their taxes. Why do you think Europeans love to cheat on their taxes? Their taxes are really high, right? And the higher the taxes are, the greater the reward is for cheating on your taxes. And so they actually have these bearer bonds, and they have these bonds are annual coupon bonds because after all, you're only going to be in Switzerland probably once per year, on your skiing holiday. So you go and you are able to cash in your coupons at the Swiss bank that's handling that sort of thing, right? And so you walk in there in your ski jacket, and your ski jacket's kind of small, but when you walk out, you're stuffed with cash from turning in all your coupons. Now, we know that investors are interested in after-tax return. After-tax return is what you've got left after the taxes are taken out. So, for example, if you've got a job here in the United States, you'll notice that there's this big number up at the top. That's what you've earned. What about that number that's actually on the check? It's after taxes, and it's much, is it bigger? Smaller. Now, which of those numbers concerns you the most? The before or the after? Yeah, the after, that's what you get to spend. The only time the before matters to you is when you're bragging to your friends about how much money you make, right? That's the only time that matters. Or when you're trying to tell your mother that you're not a failure after all, right? So, what are we going to do here with this after-tax idea? Well, what is the after-tax return on interest if you're not paying any taxes? It's exactly the same as the before-tax return. And so what does that mean about the returns that these bearer bonds have to pay? They don't have to pay as high a return because the recipients of the coupons are cheating on their taxes. And so companies are more than willing to issue these bearer bonds to these people, knowing they're going to cheat on their taxes because it lowers their cost of borrowing. You think that's ethical? I'm going to leave that one for you to decide. Okay, so what does that mean? So bearer bonds are popular with tax cheats. They're also good for laundering money. If any of you are interested in a life of crime, I'm going to tell you two things. Number one, I'm going to teach you today how to launder money. And number two, if you're still interested in crime after I've talked about this, let me know. I'll bring in my friend who did 7 years in federal prison, and he'll let you know it's a bad idea, right? Okay, so let's talk about laundering money. I have a friend who lives in California, and he had let's call him a friend, more likely a dope dealer, that he bought weed from. And this guy wanted to retire to Mexico. And this has been a long time, it's been like 20 years ago. He wanted to retire in Mexico, and his goal was to have $350,000 to go to Mexico and to do his retirement, because it's cheap to retire in Mexico. Okay, so this guy is selling drugs. By the way, do you back when such things were illegal, could you take credit cards for drugs? No. So what are you dealing with? Cash. And so now he's got all this cash. He can't really put it in the bank because it would draw unwarranted attention. So what does he do? He vacuum seals it in plastic bags, sticks them in igloo coolers, and buries them in his backyard. I'm not kidding. Man had several igloo coolers buried in his backyard with this money in it. Okay, now the time finally comes when he hits his $350,000 goal. He has several of these coolers full of money. Now, do you think he's going to be able to walk across the border crossing carrying the coolers behind him? They're the kind with wheels. So he's carrying, he's got like a train of coolers there, and you'd think they're not going to look in the coolers and ask him what's in them? No, he can't do that. So what does he do? He uses the cash to buy bearer bonds. And so now, instead of having $350,000 in cash, he has 350 bearer bonds. It takes up a whole lot less space. Plus, there's a good chance that the border guy that inspects might not even look in his briefcase for these bonds. Or if he did, might not even know what he was looking at. And so he successfully snuck into Mexico with 350 of these bearer bonds. Now, when he gets to Mexico, he has some flexibility. He can either hold on to the bonds and just cash the coupons as they come due, or he can sell the bonds and put the money in a local bank. By the way, do you think Mexican banks are as picky as American banks when it comes to large cash deposits? Probably not. And but on the other hand, there's a good chance that the bank might steal your money right? Because it's not FDIC insured. On the other hand, should he hold on to the bearer bonds? What could happen to them? Stolen, burnt, flooded, right? So his retirement wasn't going to be as relaxing as he thought it was going to be. Thoughts, questions? So, you can use bearer bonds to launder money. Should you? No, it's illegal. It's immoral. It's unethical. Don't do that. Questions? Okay. Now let's talk about the security of the bond. The security of the bond is whatever the lenders can take if the borrower doesn't pay. The security is whatever the lenders can take if the borrower doesn't pay. In the earlier example of the man who borrowed the money to buy the motorcycle, what was the security of that loan? Yeah, it's the motorcycle itself. And we see that we refer to that as collateral for those kinds of loans. But when we're talking about bonds, the security that we call collateral has a very specific meaning. And it is a basket of securities that are put up as security for this bond. And so basically, if I were General Motors and I wanted to have collateral for my bond, I would basically have less risky debt as that collateral. Probably they're sitting on a bunch of 30-year treasury bonds in their treasury that they could use as collateral. And so if General Motors didn't pay their coupons, then the lenders could come in and take those treasury bonds that had been put up as collateral. Now, would we ever see equity be put up as collateral? Would you accept a firm's stock as collateral for its bond? No, why not? Yeah, exactly. Remember, the bondholders get paid first. If the bonds are worth nothing, now we know that the stock is worth nothing. So you would never accept the stock of a company as collateral. There was one situation in which I did see, and it was back when Toys R Us, you guys remember Toys R Us? So Toys R Us had basically a U.S. organization and a Canadian organization. The U.S. organization sucked and was in a world of hurt. The Canadian organization was doing quite well. When Toys R Us, the American organization, went out to borrow money, they actually used stock that they held in the Canadian one as the security or the collateral for that loan. That's the only time I've seen equity being used as collateral. Okay, then we have mortgage securities. If you borrow money and you use it to buy property or a building, that would be called a mortgage security. And in fact, you guys probably think of mortgages as just being the money you borrow to buy a house. That's just one specific type of mortgage. You could buy land, you could buy buildings, you could buy any of that sort of real estate. We refer to those as mortgage securities if they are backed by the property. And so you could actually have bonds, issue bonds to build a plant and have the plant be the security for those bonds, and that would be a mortgage security. And then we have things called debentures. In the United States, a debenture is unsecured debt. What do you think unsecured means?
Something that happened to it.
Say again?
Something that happened to it.
Okay, well, something can happen to all these
It's
things.
not
Right?
secure.
It's not secured, right. Now, what does that mean? It means there's nothing that you're allowed to grab if the company goes bankrupt. You are just going to get the share of, you're going to be standing in line at bankruptcy and just getting your proportional share of the debt, right? And so unsecured debt is riskier than secured debt. Let's talk about what happens in the first two cases. If they fail to pay, in the first case, I just take that basket of bonds. In the second case, if they fail to pay, I take their corporate headquarters, if that was what the mortgage security was secured by. But in this debenture thing, I'm having to wait for all those people to grab all those assets, and then I have to wait for the remaining assets to be liquidated, and then maybe I will get paid. So which is riskier? Hang on just a second. Which is riskier, a secured piece of debt or an unsecured? The unsecured has to be riskier, right? Yes.
In 682, we've been talking about something called an initial marginal balance.
Oh, wow.
Do companies ever have that for like a security or collateral?
You're like way over my head now. Initial marginal balance. I'm going to have to look that up. Is Dr. Jones your professor?
Doug.
Oh, Doug Whitty?
Yeah.
I'll ask Doug.
Okay.
Doug, explain to me initial, what's it called?
Initial marginal. Well, it's just like a chunk of money that people have for trading currencies.
Oh,
But so it's
okay.
Like, do they have it?
So it's the margin balance.
Yeah. Like
Yeah, okay.
collateral.
Oh, yeah, I know what that is. No, we're not talking about, no, that's a different thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Phew, I thought Doug did something that I didn't. Oh. Okay. Actually, Doug does know how to do triangle arbitrage with bid-ask spread. Has he made you guys do that yet?
Hopefully, I'll never learn how to do that.
Oh, no, you will.
Okay.
If you have Doug, you will. Okay. Let's see. So we know debentures are riskier. Now, as a result, what do you think that's true about the yield and maturity on a debenture versus an otherwise identical mortgage security or collateralized bond? If it's riskier, the yield and maturity has to be higher, right? Because risk and return have to go together. Okay, and then earlier we had mentioned about notes, and we talked about the time to maturity. But there's one more thing that we need to mention here, and that is that notes are unsecured. Notes are unsecured. So if I say note, it has basically two pieces of information. Number one, it's unsecured, and number two, it's between 1 and 10 years. Now, for those of you who trained in the British system, a debenture in the UK is actually collateralized, or it's got security. I don't even know why we use the same term for two different things, but if you end up working in the UK, and I'm looking at two people here I think might end up working at the UK, so be careful because they're freaky about that. Questions? So now let's talk about seniority. How many of you have ever worked at a job where seniority mattered? So first of all, what is seniority?
Well, it's kind of like your position, how long you've been there.
Yeah, how long you've been there. So on the job, your seniority is determined by how long you've been there. And what sorts of things did you get to do as a more senior employee that more junior employees didn't?
Oh, well, I'm not a senior employee, but I work in an accounting firm, so.
Oh, okay, so let's word it the
managers-
other way. What are you last in line for?
Everything.
Everything, right? He's the last guy in. So he gets last shot at vacation time. He gets last shot at coffee. I mean, everything, basically. Everybody gets to stand in line before him. And so we see that we have something similar going on with debt. There's this order of seniority. And the order of seniority has to do with where you're standing at in this line at bankruptcy. And so first we have the senior debt. And the senior debt, they're going to get paid first. Let's not say first, because we got the government and all sorts of people here. But among the bondholders, they're going to get paid first. And then we have right behind them are the junior bonds. They are not as senior as the senior bonds, but they're right there behind the senior debt holders. After the senior debt holders are paid in full, then we turn our attention to the junior debt holders. Pardon me. And then, if the junior debt holders get paid in full, right behind them in line are the subordinated debt holders. Subordinate. Does that sound like it's a high thing or a low thing?
Low.
It's a low thing, right? I'm a subordinate. So it's a low thing. Okay, so those are the very last people among bondholders in line. Now, what does that mean about the risk of these things? What's the safest one up here? Senior. And what's the riskiest one? Subordinated. Now, let's ask this question. What does that mean about the yield to maturity of senior debt versus subordinated debt? Yeah, so it's got to be lower, right? Because if there's less risk, the senior debt is less risky, therefore it's going to have a lower yield to maturity. The subordinated debt is more risky, it's going to have higher yield to maturity. And where's the junior debt going to come in? Yeah, somewhere in between, right? Does that make sense? Now let's talk about repayment. Remember, we said that bonds are an interest-only loan. And so there is no repayment of principal prior to the maturity date unless we make some sort of arrangements. Now, let's assume that people would rather I pay down this thing over time rather than trying to pay everything off at the end. By the way, which is riskier? To have a 10-year bond in which 10% of the principal gets paid off every year, this for the bond issue, or one where you wait till the very end and then all the money is due at once?
Very end.
Yeah, if you wait till the very end, that's riskier. So I go to visit my cousin Harry up in Kansas City. He's got this great house. I'm like, Harry, I know you can't afford this. How did you buy this house? He says, oh, I've got this great mortgage. And I said, what's the great mortgage? He says, well, my mortgage payments are small. They don't even actually cover the interest. So my balance gets bigger every year. But then at 10 years, it all comes due. So it's a balloon mortgage. I said, what are you going to do at 10 years? He says, I don't know. What do you think happened at the 10-year mark? One of two things has to happen. Number one, either Harry goes and refinances the remaining amount with another loan, or number two, he fails to make the payment, loses the house. He failed to make the payments and he lost the house, right? And so it's riskier to have this big payment hanging out there. And so your lenders would prefer that you somehow pay this principal down over time. But I can't go around to all my bondholders and pay each of them $100 every year to bring down my principal by 10%, because if bond's worth 1,000, right, and I've got 100 would be 10%. I can't do that. That's not the way bonds are set up. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to repurchase bonds. I'm going to repurchase 10% of these bonds every year. And in that way, I will be paying down the principal. Does that make sense? So if I've got 10,000 bonds outstanding, all I've got to do is buy 1,000 of those bonds back every year. And when I buy a bond back, I'm paying off that portion of the loan. And so the principal would go down 10% every year. If the bonds are sold in the open market, which bonds are traded a lot like stocks, it's easy, right? All I have to do is go out to the open market and buy these bonds back. If the bonds are not traded in the open market, I have to have something called a call provision, and we'll discuss the call provision next time. But basically, it allows me to force you to sell your bond back to me. Okay, now, where does this money come from? There's this thing called a sinking fund. A sinking fund is money set aside to buy back the bonds. Now, why do we call it a sinking fund? When we first issue bonds, we say we are floating a bond issue. What's the opposite of floating? Sinking. And so the monies that I use to bring that, or to buy that debt back, is the sinking fund. And so what happens is there's this bond trustee, it's a third party, and the borrower gives money to the bond trustee to put into the sinking fund, and the bond trustee goes out and either in the open market or through calling the bonds, they buy those bonds back. Now, sinking fund reduces the risk of a bond to bondholders. Given what I've just told you, can anyone explain to me why it would reduce the risk to the bondholders for there to be a sinking fund?
Your sinking fund will protect them.
Okay, how?
So money set aside,
Okay, so it's money that's being set aside, and what are they using that money for?
buy the debt back,
To buy the debt back, what does that do to the principal of the loan?
frozen.
It
more.
lowers, right? They're buying it down. And so that means instead of having that big old balloon payment problem, we've just got a tiny little bit there to pay off at the end. So that's why a bond with a sinking fund, all else equal, will be safer than a bond without one. Now, what do you think that means for the yield to maturity? Which one would have a higher yield to maturity? A bond with a sinking fund or without?
Without.
Yeah, without, because it's riskier, it's got to have a higher yield to maturity.
So long-term bonds are riskier.
Okay, so, yeah, I kind of like your point here. Long-term bonds are riskier in that, that big chunk of money that's out there for, say, 30 years, it's out, let's say 30 versus 1. Do you think I could tell whether the company was going to be financially solvent in 1 year? Pretty good chance that I could, right?
Yeah.
What about 30 years?
Yeah.
You don't know, right? That's what the problem was with these guys that bought those GM bonds. They were sure back when they bought those bonds in whatever year that 30 years from then, GM would still be in business.
I was just confusing it with the stocks because the short-term stocks which we buy in the newer firms are more riskier, so more. So
Oh,
that is why I was like, long.
no. Yeah, so newer firms are riskier, smaller firms are riskier. You're right
Yeah.
about that for their stock.
Yeah, I know.
And you would also
I was
say
mixing
that-
it up with stocks and bonds, same thing.
Yeah, you got to be careful conflating those because let's say that a brand new company issued long-term debt. It would be riskier than the long-term, or than maybe the, let's say a brand new company issued short-term debt. It might be safer than the long-term debt of an older company. Does that make sense? Yeah, don't get those things conflated in your head. That's dangerous.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think I have enough time to do justice to the call provision. I am certain that you'll sit on a beach somewhere and contemplate the call provision and think very deeply about it. By the way, you have enough information now to go ahead and do your homework, get that done, get it out of the way before you leave town so you can be relaxed. Happy spring break.